Hello again. In this video, I'm going to pick up where I left off last time on the KMAC video, but this is going to talk about a different topic, mainly Latino immigration in the United States. The main book I'm going to be using to help me out in this video is Beyond Borders, A History of Mexican Migration to the United States by Timothy Henderson. Also, Walls and Mirrors by David Gutierrez is a good one that I'll be referring to, and a couple others as well. Just to reiterate, the reason I'm doing a separate video is because this has nothing to do with the Kevin McDonald chapter that I did a review of previously, and I think it's an important element of immigration history that I think a lot of right-wingers don't really look at, and was well underway before 1965, and honestly, so the 65 Act is really only tangentially related to this topic anyway. So I'm basically just going to start from the beginning and go to roughly the modern period. And I've done a video that covers some of the topics that I'm going to cover in this video, so I'll refer to that sometimes, and I'll put a link in the description for that. And yeah, let's get into it. First, we could start with the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave us a bunch of territory that was previously Mexican territory. It's a little difficult to estimate the number of Mexicans who became naturalized US citizens from this process, and this territory wasn't super populated by Mexicans anyway, but estimates hover around 80 to 100,000 people. And because this land was so sparsely populated, not a lot of infrastructure, it was kind of prime real estate to be worked on and needed a lot of manpower, a lot of cheap labor, and railroads, big agriculture, those types of companies and industries set out to utilize this space. So that's kind of the reoccurring theme that's going to be seen throughout this video, is that big ag, big railroad, etc. were kind of the main big players here. And in the beginning, this kind of labor was done mainly by Chinese immigrants, and you can see classic pictures of Chinese working on railroads and stuff like that. However, this came to an end with the Chinese Exclusion Act, and the other source of manual labor for this kind of work was done by Japanese laborers, but this was also taken out of the equation with the Gentlemen's Agreement in 1907 that virtually ended Japanese immigration, coupled with the fact that the later 1924 Act blocked off a lot of Southern and Eastern European cheap migrant labor that could have been used, but even then, just the proximity alone would have made that difficult as well. So the next logical step was just to go across the border to mainly Mexican laborers. And just some quick stats for reference, by 1900, between 70 and 90% of the track crews on the railroads of the Southwest were Mexican. And although it's kind of hard to assess the immigration stats for this time period across the southern border, because there wasn't really an organized border patrol or process at this point, most scholars would say that at least 1 million Mexicans immigrated from 1890 to 1929, and that the Mexican-born population grew from roughly 100,000 to 222,000 from 1900 to 1910, and then that doubled by 1920. It's a little difficult to gauge exactly the population numbers and immigration numbers all the time, especially because a lot of immigration was circular, they would come in for a time and then go back to Mexico, oftentimes not through a border checkpoint and counted or something like that. It was a very porous border, but at the very least, immigration increased, and just the Mexican population within the US was increasing, spurred on by economic incentives, and you even had recruiting companies and agents from agricultural, railroad, mining operations, etc. in Mexico itself, recruiting cheap labor, and also internal political strife in Mexico and revolutions and stuff that created kind of a push-pull factor in immigration. Not to mention World War I, which led to a lot of positions that were filled by American citizens becoming vacant because obviously they were drafted and whatnot, and food production needed to be increased at this time. So all these factors led to the increase in Mexican immigration to the US. And of course, at this time, there was a lot of immigration restrictionist activity going on that I talked about in my previous video, like the Literacy Act that was passed in 1917 and the 1924 Quota Act. But Mexicans and generally Western Hemisphere immigrants were exempted from these acts, with Secretary of Labor William B. Wilson specifically exempting them from the 1917 Act, and various business and state interests creating an exemption in 1924, with Charles Evan Hughes leading that push for an exemption, mainly just to establish good relations with Mexico, but obviously there were economic incentives as well. And Herbert Hoover at the time also echoed these sentiments as leader of the U.S. Food Administration during the wartime effort. And these types of sentiments were earlier expounded upon by economists like Victor Clark in the 1911 Dillingham Commission, on immigration, which did advocate immigration restriction, but not from Mexico, and wanted to utilize cheap Mexican labor, with the caveat that they would more than likely just return home after their labor was done, mainly due to the kind of seasonal work that they were engaged in. This isn't to say, however, that there wasn't a push against Mexican immigration. A lot of the same people who were against unrestricted European immigration were also against this Mexican immigration, like Samuel Gompers, once again, the leader of the American Federation of Labor, was against it because it suppressed wages for American workers and laborers, as well as groups like the American Legion and Daughters of the American Revolution. But as I've said, business interests and diplomatic interests kind of drown those voices out. Already mentioned Hughes, but organizations like the National Grange, the American Farm Bureau Federation, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Although the 1924 Act at the least did establish the Border Patrol on the southern border, it wasn't super robust at the beginning, but at least did help in kind of keeping track of and counting border crossings. So that was at least a start to getting better data on the situation. And even back then, Mexicans were considered legally white, and I'm pretty sure that even is something that is still around today, like on US Census reports, that Latinos are considered white. That's always kind of confused me. I'm not sure exactly how they count that. Like, I know there's Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic white, different categories. It's always kind of confused me and just makes the whole situation even more complex. But anyways, around this time you have people like Ralph Taylor from the California Agricultural Legislative Committee saying a lot of the similar arguments that we sometimes hear today, that white people don't want to do this work, black people also aren't suited for it, etc. So Mexicans are kind of perfect for the job. And this is not to say that these people advocating for Mexican immigration necessarily saw them as equal citizens or wanted them to become citizens. If anything, at most, maybe like second-class citizens. But it was, essentially just cheap labor, and they were good at what they do, and no more was needed, really, to put it bluntly. With one wealthy rancher kind of summing up the situation in 1928, saying, "We have no Chinamen, we have no Japs, the Hindu is worthless, the Filipino is nothing, and the white man will not do the work." And that's not to say just business or political actors supported immigration. Religious groups, Protestant and Catholic, supported immigration from Mexico. Protestants mainly because they saw it as a pool of potential converts, and Catholics because it just increased the Catholic population. And that's something I delve into a little bit in my previous video. And not only that, of course, ethnic Mexican groups start to spring up, like LULAC, and we'll see later on other ethnic Mexican Latino organizations spring up to advocate for the Latino population. So that kind of sums up the general view until we get to the Great Depression and things start to change. Obviously, with the economic downturn, there's just a general employment crisis, loss of jobs, etc. And immigrants, legal or illegal, are going to be the first ones to kind of get the short end of the stick. You even see people like Herbert Hoover, who was previously pro-immigration, reversing his position on this issue. And the first kind of large-scale deportations and arrests of immigrants started to take place, with about 150,000 repatriated over the course of the 1930s. But the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of this immigration already was kind of circular, so some of these people may have gone back anyway at a certain time. In Brian Grattan's paper on this subject, he kind of suggests that the deportations in the 1930s were somewhat exaggerated, or at least not too effective, and that the population in the 30s of Mexicans in the US was actually stable and led to further population growth. But regardless of how you view it, there was certainly an increased Mexican population from all the previous immigration and people just being born here, etc. It was, inevitably increasing, even with economic downturns and some deportations. But the next big event that takes place that changes the situation once again is US entry into World War II. With this, obviously, a lot of the US male workforce has to go and fight in the war, so there's a need for workers, once again, especially agricultural workers, to provide food rations. So this kind of starts off officially the Bracero program, in which Mexican laborers from Mexico go through an actual government process to become legal workers in the US. Now, technically, the program was supposed to end after the war, but it kept getting extended and lasted over 20 years. And facilitated the immigration of millions of legal and illegal immigrants as well. Again, not all permanently residing in the US, but definitely some of them did, and just further solidified the relationship between Southwest business and Mexican laborers. So really, it was just a continuation of previous immigration patterns, but just in a more legalized, structured framework that agribusiness and railroads once again lobbied for and argued was necessary for their kind of work and business to operate. But because the program insisted upon certain standards in terms of like wages and living conditions for the workers, there was still a desire for illegal immigrants because they would just work for less and were essentially less of a hassle to hire. So at the height of the program, there were hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants on top of the legal Bracero workers. And so while there were deportations eventually, a lot of these illegal workers were basically proto-amnestied in a sense by going through a process colloquially called drying out the wetbacks, whereby they would be sent to the Mexican border only to put 1 foot on Mexican soil and then come right back into the US, and just to go through kind of a legal loophole to become legal workers in a sense. I'm not sure about like the full specifics and details of it, but it was basically just like a BS thing to, oh look, we did what we needed to do to legalize them. But eventually there were deportations, most notably in the 50s, called Operation Wetback. But even during this time, it actually was the peak of the legal number of immigrants under the Bracero program. So even while there was more deportations, there was still like a net influx of Mexican immigrants. But leading up to this, the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act passed, which I talked about in my previous video. And under this act, it became illegal to harbor or import illegal aliens. However, Texas lawmakers were able to implement a Texas proviso under this law, which gave an exception to employing illegal immigrants. So employment was not considered harboring or importing, which obviously let these southwestern growers and businesses do what they were doing previously. But anyway, around this time, there kind of came to be a boiling point of ethnic tensions. There was the Red Scare, fear of communism, previously the Zoot Suit riots in California, just general dislike of Mexicans because obviously they were growing in numbers, and as well as a slowdown in the economy in 1953. Not like as bad as the Great Depression obviously, but just again, when there's a slowdown in the economy, migrants and immigrants are going to be looked at, and that's kind of what led to the decision to pursue deportation strategy in 1954 under Operation Wetback. And although there were protests from pro-immigration forces, there were hundreds of thousands of illegals who eventually did leave the US. Some estimates even go up to 1 million, but many say that those estimates are exaggerated. And nonetheless, kind of like what I said earlier, that it just led to a reliance on more legal workers. So at the end of the day, it's not like it really fixed anything or changed demographics really in any serious sense. As one immigration historian put it, that it attacked the symptoms, not the causes of illegal immigration. And one of the main goals, I guess you could say, of the Bracero program was explicitly not to take away jobs from native workers and replace them with laborers from the program, which it in fact did. So on that front, it was also just blatantly a failure, even from its stated goals. And although most Braceros were temporary workers, up to 50,000 a year were permanent residents, and that, like, this is all well before 1965 immigration, so yeah, not like an overwhelming crazy amount of immigration, but definitely a consistent amount of immigration from south of the border. Eventually, the program did get ended, however. There was a small uptick in the numbers during the Korean War for the same reasons that there was a need for it in the first place with World War II, but essentially it just kept getting extended almost on a yearly basis due to the complaints of businesses and agriculture, but other groups were just more insistent, and the need eventually for this cheap type of labor waned. With the introduction of mechanization and more modern practices, there was just less of a need for workers in general. Not only that, but various religious and kind of civic groups were opposed to the Bracero program because they saw that it reduced wages and just was not necessarily giving the Mexican workers, legal workers, the same rights and conditions as normal US workers in general. And so the Bracero program was essentially ended right before the passing of the 65 Act itself. So those two coincided actually really serendipitously, if that's the right word to use, and the effects of both wouldn't be seen until later. But basically the combo of ending the Bracero program program, the 65 Act, which I talked about in my last video, that involves chain migration, and as further legislation that we'll talk about, all kind of led to the situation we see today with Latino immigration. But essentially all the jobs that were filled by previous Bracero workers were still around. They needed to be filled. But with the cutting off of the program and what the 65 Act did, and a later amendment as well, put a cap on Western Hemisphere immigration and put an individual cap on each country in the Western Hemisphere of 20,000 immigrants a year, it really restricted the amount of legal immigrants that were possible to fill these positions. So at the end of the day, all it really did was incentivize illegal immigration. And you can see here in this graph that it basically shows the number of legal immigrants dropping and illegal rising to basically the same levels. And something that I haven't heard talked about a lot is the 65 Act actually led to a lot of deportations of Mexicans. So once again, I think an overemphasis is put on that act. It's been labeled even by some as being racist against Latinos. So I definitely think that if you watch my last video and watch this one, you'll come to the same conclusion. But this video really isn't about the 65 Act itself, so let's continue. But I hope you can at least see that the main kind of mechanisms at play here are basically like employers and laborers, not so much like government policy. The fact of the matter is that the push-pull of economics and the desire for cheap labor and the desire for better living conditions and wage conditions, and relative to Mexico at least, is gonna contribute to this like way more than any liberal immigration policy or what have you from the government itself. And we'll see again that it's mainly like employers that are kind of the ones pushing pro-immigration policies in the future post-65 as well. But that's not to say that there is also a rise of ethnic advocacy groups from Latinos themselves, the continuing work of the church, and like always some Jews thrown into the mix as well. So let's get into that. And the first thing I want to focus on is actually kind of an ironic situation in which you have an actual immigration restrictionist, James Eastland, advocating against employer sanctions for hiring illegal immigrants. And employer sanctions is a pretty big thing that comes up again and again and is battled over in Congress. Eastland was a restrictionist and not a proponent of the 65 Act, stuff like that, but when it came to cheap Mexican labor, he was more pro-immigration, at least just to acquire cheap workers. And he blocked the first employer sanctions bill in 1972. And because he was the head of appointments for Immigration and Naturalization Services, basically during the 60s and early 70s, no employer sanctions really passed. And this situation didn't really change until Eastland was replaced by Marine Corps General Leonard Chapman. But even with Chapman, who was more of an alarmist on the immigration issue, ethnic groups and business kind of combined forces to still try and battle employer sanctions. I talked earlier about organizations like LULAC, but that organization was actually more about like assimilating Latinos and was almost anti-illegal immigration. It was more moderate because at the time it was seen to be more prudent to just like assimilate and adapt to the US lifestyle and follow like legal precedent. But groups like MALDEF and La Raza formed in the 70s and 60s, and these were more, I guess you'd say, radical groups who advocated for legal and illegal immigration, or at least not like deportations and any harsh penalties. And MALDEF, standing for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, was actually founded by the Ford Foundation, which is pretty funny considering Henry Ford was the founder of that. Not sure how he'd feel about that necessarily. And I'm pretty sure the Ford Foundation has been involved in a lot of like conspiratorial things that people talk about. I'm not too knowledgeable about that. But yeah, all three of these orgs during this time kind of came around to be more aggressive in their assertions for like Latino rights and stuff like that, including illegals. Even people like Cesar Chavez softened up to the illegal immigrants. He was previously more hardline on them. And as I've talked about before in the previous video, the AFL-CIO became more pro-immigration, and Latinos also carved out a niche for themselves in the AFL-CIO with their own group. So that's basically all just to say that ethnic advocacy from Latinos started getting into gear at this time as well. And because many of these ethnic advocacy groups were aligned with like unions and kind of under the banner of workers' rights and stuff, it was kind of odd bedfellows that they were aligned with big business. And as one MALDEF leader put it in 1980, 1982. I would dance with the devil if I had to defeat the measure being like employer sanctions. And so this coalition of advocacy groups more or less stifled President Jimmy Carter's immigration plans to deal with the illegal immigration problem. The basic outline was always essentially that there would be sanctions, there would be some kind of ID system in place to ID who was legal and who was not in terms of workers, as well as an amnesty plan of some kind. But even this was considered too much, according to these groups, and basically all efforts to pass restrictive immigration policies at the federal level between 1970 and 85 were stymied by the Hispanic caucus, even though they were pretty underrepresented in Congress and just the general population. And Alan Simpson, who we'll talk about more with the Simpson-Mazzoli bill, echoed these sentiments by saying that short-term interests were constantly cutting across the long-term national interests, and a thinly veiled reference to Mexican Americans and other Latino activists. But anyway, in the late 70s, after Carter's plan kept failing in Congress, as well as anti-immigration groups like FAIR coming into existence, and environmentalists like Paul Ehrlich, who was half Jewish, talking about the negative effects of immigration into the United States, kind of galvanized more debates on the topic. So Carter, he, at the urging of Ed Kennedy, appointed a commission led by Father Theodore Hesburgh, who I've talked about in my other video, but essentially the Hesburgh Commission, as it was later called, basically just echoed Carter's previous plans that legal immigration was great, illegal immigration was not so great, so basically endorsing employer sanctions, beefing up the border patrol, but also, and this is the most important thing, suggesting a generous amnesty program for illegals. So in 1982, the first legislative proposal of this commission's findings came to be drafted by Alan Simpson and Romano Mazzoli, and by this time Carter had left office and Ronald Reagan was in office. And Reagan, in some ways, was probably even more of like an open borders, kind of hands-off guy than Carter was in terms of immigration. So that just added more friction in the whole debate. And what was kind of missing from the Mazzoli-Simpson proposal was a guest worker program, somewhat analogous to the Bracero program, which Simpson rejected because, as he noted, that the Bracero program was accompanied by a steep rise in illegal immigration. But ironically, his plan to amnesty illegals also would, in the end, incentivize more illegal immigration, like it kind of did during the Bracero program anyway, with the process of drying out. So that was basically the debate going on in the 80s. Like I said earlier, people like Paul Ehrlich, who later joins FAIR, which I'm pretty sure today is run by a Jew, just want to put that in there, and the entry of a lot of Cubans and Haitians as refugees, which actually started in the late 50s, early 60s, even before the 65 Act, and at least for the Cubans, a lot of it was for like anti-communist purposes, whatever, but that continued and was occurring in the 80s as well, and that's something I go over in my other video once again, a lot of that being done under the auspices of the Catholic Church as well as evangelical organizations, but also just the government itself. And from the legal side of things, you have in 1982 Plyler versus Doe, which said that states could not deny public education to the children of undocumented immigrants, which Justin William Brennan wrote the majority opinion on. And just speaking of the 14th Amendment, that's kind of where you get the whole idea of anchor babies from. And while it was passed shortly after the Civil War ended, mainly because of freed blacks, it was used in a later Supreme Court case in 1898, United States v. Wong Kem Ark, where an Asian immigrant had children here, and there was a debate whether those children should be counted as citizens, even though he wasn't, and the Supreme Court found in favor of the affirmative. And in both of these cases, both of the courts were like completely Gentile, I checked, so no Jews. But anyway, that was kind of the landscape up until 1986, when the Simpson-Mazzoli Act finally passed, officially called the Immigration Reform and Control Act. And basically this act had all the stuff that the earlier Hesburgh Commission wanted, but there are two things I want to bring up real quickly. One is that Chuck Schumer is kind of identified as the guy, not who like proposed the bill or co-sponsored it or anything like that, but he did end up getting it out of deadlock by striking a deal with big agricultural businesses who were obviously against the bill, against employer sanctions. And he did this by implementing like more of a guest worker program and allowing for a specific amnesty that was a bit more generous for certain agricultural workers. So Chuck Schumer was important for the passing of the bill, but the grand outline of the bill was already in place before him, and as I've talked about, had been discussed for over a decade at this point. and at a certain point would have passed anyway, but Chuck Schumer was pivotal for the passage of this specific bill in that sense that he was able to strike a certain deal to get it passed. And the second thing I want to bring up is that while it did have employer sanctions, they ended up being pretty toothless and easily run around by just claiming to have unwillingly or unknowingly hired undocumented workers. There was just no way to securely ID any legal or illegal workers. Basically, the mechanisms in place to do so were easily bypassed, more or less. But the most important thing about the bill was its amnesty, which ended up amnestying about 3 million undocumented workers. This was way more than what was expected, and there was widespread fraud. And while it did lead to a lull in illegal immigration for a time, it quickly regained its former pace. And only a couple years after they were amnestied, a lot of these people were able to essentially abuse chain migration and get relatives and whatnot over across the border. So it just creates a multiplier effect, which we've discussed in the previous video. So this is really like kind of the start of the, at least government-led initiative or policy or bill, whatever, that kind of legalized this sort of pattern. Although the problem was underway decades before, this just really aggravated things, and it doesn't even stop there, because in 1990, there was a further immigration reform that just expanded immigration. It just upped the immigration ceiling and increased each country's cap. So that only dealt with legal immigration, but it still just led to more legal immigration in that sense. So by the early 1990s, it was pretty apparent that the 1986 bill was a failure and basically just increased illegal immigration and the overall number of Mexicans in the US by quite a lot. And ironically, as the 1986 bill was passed under Reagan, the 1996 bill, called the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act of 96, was passed under Clinton, which was supposed to clamp down on immigration. This bill was basically supposed to beef up border security, impose harsher penalties on illegal immigrants in the states, and just generally kind of deter illegal immigration. But once again, there was like unforeseen consequences, and basically all this did was it just inspired illegal immigrants who were here to just attain citizenship and naturalization. So really all it did was kind of echo the previous 1986 bill in a certain way. So a total failure once again, and some people would say that maybe Clinton knew this would happen and knew he was just going to get more Democrat voters, especially with Vice President Al Gore at the time streamlining a program called Citizenship USA, which basically streamlined citizenship applications from a couple years to a couple months. But regardless, I would say those two acts are kind of like the groundwork for what we see today. It's kind of a catch-22, if that's the right term to use, that you can't be too harsh on enforcement because it just pushes people to become citizens, and you can't just give amnesty because people abuse that. Since these two acts, there hasn't been any major legislation. It's really been kind of stifled. There was some more like beefing up of the border and stuff like that due to 9/11, but that was really only kind of like a window dressing, I would say. I mean, it's not like a bunch of people were deported or really like the illegal immigration issue was really tackled in any serious way. That was more just like for security concerns over terrorism. I'm sure there's been different years of fluctuating deportations and border enforcement, stuff like that, but I can't really think of any kind of legislation that really impacted immigration too much, besides maybe DACA in 2012, which was passed under Janet Napolitano, which, as the name implies, kind of just deferred action, so it just pushed the problem off to a later date, which we're seeing now. And the Gang of Eight, which included Chuck Schumer in 2013, 2014, failed to pass any real reform. So unless I'm missing any big legislation or anything, there really hasn't been any solution to this problem, and obviously we see that with the election of Trump. That was a big reason why he was elected, and he didn't end up quote-unquote fixing anything, and obviously Biden isn't really gonna do anything, so the whole situation is basically a mess. Really no easy solution, quick fix, but this is kind of the groundwork for why that is. I think it gives pretty good historical context, and I think a good article written on this was one written by Douglas Massey, where he goes over some of the major laws. He talks about how really at the end of the day it was an issue of employers wanting cheap labor, and it's basically just a match made in heaven that there's cheap Mexicans across the border that would work these types of jobs, and these businesses cared more about making money than following border laws or whatever. Like the perfect combination of push and pull factors. And that the 65 Act, while installing chain migration as a thing to be easily abused and utilized, it wasn't until that was coupled with amnesty that the Latino immigration issue became to be like a really big deal, as well as creating harsh enforcement on the problem. All that did was really incentivize people to become citizens, which can be seen during the 96 Act, as well as the 2001 Patriot Act. So basically just a reiteration of everything I said. I would highly recommend people read that article. I think it's like the most concise thing written on this subject that kind of lays it all out. Also the Tim Henderson book, if you want something a bit longer. But Massey does provide a counterfactual, which I think is interesting, in which he says that if the Bracero program, rather than having been ended, was just tweaked a bit, and the US not intervening in Central and Latin America generally, which caused more refugees from that area, then the situation would look a lot different than it is today. And he ends the article talking about how there's, at the time, 11 million illegals with 3 million illegal children. He wrote this in 2011, the number is like way higher now, and suggests that the children should be amnestied and become full citizens, whereas the parents could just get some kind of legal status but not become citizens. And yeah, that article was written over a decade ago at this point, and the longer people wait to do anything, the more likely it is that people just get amnestied. I think most people watching this video would probably prefer something a bit more harsh, especially because amnesties have been abused in the past. But honestly, this article was written like over 10 years ago. The problem has not gotten any better. And just personally, I really doubt anything significant is going to change that would really be looked upon very kindly by more conservative, nationalistic people. That's just my hunch, and not really a risky one at that. But I think the title of his article is aptly named, Unintended Consequences. And that's basically the theme I kind of want to leave off at, that all these government policies that passed all had unintended consequences. I don't think people were looking very far ahead. I don't think a lot of this stuff was planned out. I think people just wanted short-term solutions to problems that were way beyond kind of like a short-term thing. And ironically, maybe less government intervention and this kind of stuff would have just made things go a little bit smoother and not be so dramatic in terms of like waves of people being allowed into the country at once, amnestied, and like a bunch of illegal immigration. Perhaps it could have been avoided if the regular cycle of circular immigration, temporary work was just kept. And I guess at the end of the day, who knows? But I think it's without a doubt that regardless of these bills and acts, that there was going to be a certain level of Latino immigrants and a Latino population in the US. There's just no way to avoid that. However, these things definitely exasperated the issue. And with all my videos, I just kind of want to show that the topic is more nuanced and complex and wide-reaching than most people think. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next one.